Welcome to Breaking the News Plus on this Monday night. We're going to have a conversation with two of my colleagues from Denver who have been working on a documentary called ICE Air, and it focuses on what happens to people who are detained by immigration enforcement and taken into custody. It's a wild story from there. To welcome to our program tonight, Chris Vanderveen and Chris Hansen from KUSA in Denver. Thanks for joining us tonight, guys. So
Thanks for having us, Jana.
Sorry for getting on your toes here. It's a long way from here to Denver for the little satellites to talk to each other. I want to talk about the premise for ICE Air, because you talk about in your introduction quick arrests and removals. We've seen that here in Minnesota since January. Millions of people voted for this. Millions of people wanted it. It was a fulfillment of a campaign promise. But you started to look in what happened to a person after they were detained, and you discovered something between the arrest and the removal of the detainee that you weren't quite seeking out.
It's really interesting what we found within there, and Chris can describe the data process. My colleague Chris Hansen over here can describe the data process, but I want to make sure that this is clear, that this is not an investigation, this is not a documentary on the legitimacy or lack of legitimacy of deportations. We know there's been a lot of deportations. You in Minnesota have seen the net results of a lot of deportations out of there. But this is an investigation of what happens before the deportations. And we were able to sort of like identify not just planes and routes, but people within those planes that are being transferred in ways that sometimes defy common sense. People going from Florida to Colorado to California. This is a very expensive proposition that's been put forth by ICE. And the argument can be made, is this being as efficient as it can be? And I certainly think what we found is that no, the answer to that is no.
Chris Hansen, why don't you talk to me about how this idea started? Because when you watch ICE Air, you do get to see graphically with data people being moved around, and it doesn't, as Chris Vanderveen just said, it doesn't make a lot of sense as to why. So how did you notice this, and what patterns did you find?
Yeah, so a big piece of this in pairing with the flight data is we analyze data from the Deportation Data Project, which takes federal detention data, and it's anonymized, but you can see when someone is booked in and booked out of a certain detention facility. So in your example, in Minneapolis, the Whipple Detention Center. So we could see the date and time that someone has left there, the date and time they would maybe check into a facility in El Paso, and then maybe a facility where they went back to Minneapolis and were returned to Minnesota. You could see those date and times and how they correlated with the flight data.
So we see in ICE Air, they're moved around many, many times. The big question is why? What's the reason from our federal government?
I think I don't know if we've fully come to an answer on that. And it's interesting, we talked to senators for this documentary and they still don't fully know the answer to that. I think that's a combination of things. One, as you well know, there's been a ton of money that's been put by Congress into the hands of DHS that goes through ICE. A lot of money leads to a lot of inefficiencies. We just see that within the federal government. I think there is another theory that I think gains a lot of momentum, but the more people you talk to, certainly more the attorneys you talk to, that suggests that ICE is doing this on purpose to potentially put people away from legal representation. You saw this in Minnesota during the height of Operation Metro Surge, where a lot of people were quickly removed within hours of arrest and then sent to El Paso, Texas. We were there with a flight where a number of people were returned, one of which was returned the next day after he was removed from Minnesota, because federal judges are saying, hey, you're moving this individual to Texas. What you did goes against their due process rights. As you know, there's been a huge increase in habeas petitions in Minnesota, around the country, of lawyers that are trying to fight this. And so what's happened now is that judges are saying, hold on a second, something's going on here that we don't like, and they're ordering them sent back to Minnesota. That is proof, many people would say, that something is not right with what's taking place with these removals, and then just transferring them around the country.
Yeah, as I watched ICE Air, we heard from several different attorneys in the piece make an argument that this is designed to be confusing. So a person, let's say a person detained in Minnesota, if they're taken to Texas, then has to find representation in Texas to file a habeas form if they so choose. And I heard that firsthand from people, little kids actually, that were taken from places like Columbia Heights, and then they were taken immediately to Dilley Detention Facility in Texas. And it would happen on the same day before anybody really knew what was going on or that they were gone.
And you know that it's the speed to which it happens. And you know, lots of these folks, lots of these detainees don't have legal representation. So there are, in those instances, large percentage of people don't have legal representation, so there are not habeas petitions that are filed in those particular cases. But the habeas petitions allow us a window into what's going on in the legal system by people who have that legal representation. And really the challenging issue is that once you're sent from Minnesota, you may even have legal representation in Minnesota, but then you're sent to Texas, for example. You may not have legal representation there, and the habeas filing, if you are in Texas at the time that it's noticed, the habeas petition has to be filed in that judicial district down in Texas. So a Minnesota attorney may represent them, but they may not be able to represent them in the federal system in Texas. So yes, this is a very confusing system, and a lot of skeptics, a lot of critics say this is done intentionally to sort of disrupt, and then also in the long run, encourage self-deportation, which I think that even the federal government has been very open about saying, yes, self-deportation is really the goal here, and it seems like that's happening quite a bit.
And Jana, I want to jump in, just talking about Minneapolis. We analyzed the flight data at MSP, and what we saw in January 24, they were seeing ICE flights every other week. So every 2 weeks they were seeing an ICE flight out of Minnesota. In January of 26, they are seeing 2 or 3 flights a day. And so the speed at which they have flights available to move people is at just in a matter of hours.
And I don't know if you heard this or not in some of the documents that are publicly available from THS or ICE. They note that they can move people around because places are too crowded. They don't have enough room. It's more efficient this way. Is that what you were hearing as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And you saw that in Whipple, where it's not large. There's not a lot of people that can stay there. And so ICE's really response is like, look, we have to move people around because of bed space. And I certainly think that is absolutely an issue. But what you see within those court records is sort of an acknowledgement from federal judges. Some of these are Trump appointees, by the way, that are saying, like, hold on, you can't have this massive operation like you had in Minneapolis, an Operation Metro Surge, where they're getting a lot of people, 2 to 3 flights a day outside of the state, but have no real place for them to stay in Minnesota. So you're forced to remove. And what the judges are saying in their rulings are like, hold on a second, your forced removal, your removal to Texas, you didn't even plan this out well enough, and that's why we're returning people back to Minnesota. So while I think there is an argument to be made, yes, bed space is absolutely an issue, but what judges are saying, well, if bed space is an issue, then why are you coming in here with such vigor to try to remove people from Minnesota when you don't have a plan B as to where you could put them, and your plan A simply is remove to Texas and then figure out the legality of it later?
Right, figure out how to deal with people perhaps wanting to exercise their constitutional right with a habeas corpus claim. I want to know, Americans should be concerned about cost, right? We have a deficit here in this country. Were you able to find how much this costs to fly people all over the country, sometimes 2, 3, 4 different times within a span of days?
From our reporting, they're saying somewhere along the lines of $17,000 an hour, a flight hour. And we tracked one flight from Youngstown, Ohio to Bedford, Massachusetts to Indianapolis, Indiana, and then down to Alexandria, Louisiana. That flight time, we added the cost somewhere along the lines of $119,000.
And that was for one flight, and on that one day, we also tracked 65 other flights. Critical to note that the main broker in all of this, and I'm sure you've done reporting on this in Minnesota, is CSI Aviation. They're really sort of the outlet. Obviously, ICE is not flying these planes themselves. They're using a broker who then works with subcontractors around the country to sort of fly. And by the end of the latest contract with CSI Aviation, this is how much money we're talking about. We're talking about $1.5 billion in their contract alone to act as the broker for this. So there is a lot of money that's floating around. We're talking about $17,000 an hour, an estimate for 1 hour of flight. There are flights going on all over the country at all hours of the day. This is a very, very expensive operation.
Right now, we know that deportation activity is actually quite high. You know, in Minnesota, we were really focused on what was happening here during Operation Metro Surge in December and in January, when the eyes of the nation were on us. The campaign was here. But we know in recent weeks that it's definitely alive and well in other places. The New York Times reporting that a couple of weeks ago, they were hitting their quota of 2,000 deportations a day, which amounted to about 10,000 in a week. And when you look at what you all are putting, these flights, I guess my point is, in your estimation, are they still happening? Is this stuff still happening, or were these isolated incidents just over the winter?
I'm going to send this to my colleague because he told me about something just this morning that he found out. Like, there's a whole network of people that are watching these flights. You have somebody in Minnesota, there's people over in D.C., but Chris noticed something just this morning.
Yeah, there was we had been, as we've been looking at this over the last 6 months, we looked at flights in Atlanta, Georgia, and at the main airport there, Hartsfield, and we didn't find any flights going in and out of Atlanta, KATL. And just this last week, we saw a large bump, flights in every day on the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, all leading up this week. And they came in, and then they kind of vanished as far as we haven't seen any flights there today.
I know you spoke to a couple of folks who were on some of these flights, people who were arrested by the federal government, and they're on some of these flights. Did they have any idea where they were going if they were flown around more than once? No, and that's really, I mean, they're told to get on it. They get on a plane, and oftentimes we talked to a number of people in South Florida. These are Cubans in South Florida, two of which ended up here in Colorado. And I think what we heard over and over again, we saw this in the court filings too, is that people were getting on planes, and there was a part of them in the back of their mind, whether they're being told this or not, am I going back home? Where am I going? And there was widespread confusion as to when you get on one of these planes, what's happening. And eventually they show up. Again, we have people show up in Colorado that have lived their entire life in South Florida. And why are they ending up here in Colorado where they're just sort of like sit and told to be patient for a flight that may or may not come? Yes, there is widespread confusion, not just amongst the attorneys, but amongst the passengers themselves as to where they're going. And you talked a little bit about attorneys, and there are many attorneys present in ICE Air. There was a judge here in Minnesota, Chris Vanderveen, I believe you alluded to, who put in a ruling back in the spring saying, no more of this with the people who are arrested in Minnesota. They need to stay here for 72 hours. And then that judge added, due process is not a game of keep away. What do you make of that judge's statement?
I think that was a fascinating statement because it really came there. As you know, there were lots of judicial orders that were coming out fast and furious during the height of Operation Metro Surge. But I found really that one to be sort of critical because what that judge was saying, what she was saying, a Trump appointee, by the way, was that ICE was moving people so quickly out of Minnesota that it almost felt like a deliberate effort to deprive people of due process rights. And when she writes in that ruling, due process is not a game of keep away, that's precisely what she's saying. Look, people can have all sorts of thoughts about what's going on with deportation, what's going on with immigration. But the courts have been really, really clear about this. Even people from Nicaragua, even people from Cuba, even people from Mexico, they're in the country. They are entitled, Supreme Court said this repeatedly, they're entitled to due process rights. So when there is that flight that goes out of Minnesota and all of a sudden the legal representation that they had in Minnesota is now who knows where, that is a problem. And I think that judge's identification of that and saying this is not a game of keep away, everyone is entitled to this, whether people like it or not, it's the law of the land. And judges, as we know, are supposed to follow the law of the land. And I think that's very much what you saw in that ruling.
Yeah, well said, Chris. And I think that gives us a good segue to my final question for each of you, because this is not about how an American feels about immigration enforcement and what is going on. This ICE Air is about this kind of middle ground of flying people around. Like if you don't want to waste money, maybe you want to check this out because we're not really sure what this is supposed to mean and how much money we're spending. And then bigger, taking away due process rights possibly from people who are in this country. So my final question for each of you, Chris Hansen, I'll start with you. You start on this project because you notice a pattern. What would you say is your final thoughts about it, your elevator pitch for someone to watch it? What are they going to see when they sit down to watch ICE Air?
I mean, what I think from documenting as many flights as I have in the last 6 months is that most people don't know that this is occurring, amongst them. I think that while you see video circulate online of the arrests, of confrontations, of ICE agents in an area, what you don't see is this piece of the deportation effort that is moving people around. And this is happening, at MSP, here at Denver International Airport, at BWI in Baltimore, Buffalo, all across the country at these airports where commercial flights fly. And, I was able to document from inside the terminal gate, a plane passing by all the people flying out of Denver that day, unbeknownst to them.
Chris Vanderveen, your final thoughts? Your elevator pitch to what this could reveal or could interest the American people?
I break it down to a man by the name of Delvin Francisco Rodriguez. He is a man from Colorado. He lived a lot of his life in Summit County, Colorado, which is just west. It's where a lot of the ski areas here in Colorado. He's picked up in September. In October, he told the federal government, we have records of this, the federal government says, hey, I want to self-deport. I want to go to Nicaragua. I want to go back home. And he had made plans with his family to go back home. And for weeks, this individual who basically gave up in the eyes of the law, gave up his legal representation and said, look, I'm not going to fight it anymore. And we now have a system that kept Delvin Francisco Rodriguez in it for many, many more weeks. He was sent to another state, and then he ends up, for who knows what reason, in Alexandria, Louisiana. And then he's put on a bus to Natchez, Mississippi. And every week out of Alexandria, while he's there, a plane leaves from Alexandria to Nicaragua. Once a week, as like clockwork, there's a flight that goes to Nicaragua. And he stays for many more days, many more weeks. And then eventually, according to ICE, there's an investigation of this. There's a lot of congressional interest in this. He attempts suicide. And he then ends up dead a few days later after that. And the question is that an efficient system? When we are telling people, that ICE is telling people outright, give up your right, get out of the country, self-deport. And here we had an individual that was wanting to self-deport, and for weeks, the federal government kept him in custody, flew him to a number of states before this happened. I don't care what you think about immigration, whether you think it's good or bad. What happened there is not good. And to me, it's an example of an inefficient system that is not operating on all cylinders and does deserve more congressional scrutiny.
Chris Vanderveen, Chris Hansen out of KUSA in Denver, Colorado. Thank you for your time tonight on Breaking the News Plus. And thank you.
Thanks,
you can
Jana.
watch ICE Air tonight. You could watch it on our streaming app here at KARE 11 on KARE 11 Plus. You can also catch it on YouTube at any time you like. That's all for Breaking the News Plus. Good night.